literally means is like the study of knowledge. It's kind of like, how do you know something? And if you study that Aqidah, which is like Muslim theology, but there's some specific definitions, which we're not going to get into, but you can kind of, at a high level, summarize this with something that we say every day. It's something that you have to say to become Muslim, which is La ilaha illallah Muhammadur Rasulullah. And this is a very powerful statement, as we all know. But if you think about when this statement came down, when the Rasul sallallahu alaihi wasallam was bringing this statement to his people, they had stories that they were telling themselves, right? Most of the Sahaba were adults when they became Muslim, right? So they had grown up in this society where, they had this conception of God and gods and the world and how things work and how society should function and all the things that they should be doing. But this statement came and broke through all of that. And it was the thing that helped them reorient into what is the actual reality of the world. What is real. So if we look at the statement and kind of break it down, that kind of gives us a way to do that, and we have access to that. So we're going to break it into 3 parts. So the first part is La ilaha, which means there is no God. And I put an asterisk there because obviously there's a God. But this is an act of negation, right? Because before you can understand what the world is really like and what truth really is, you have to get rid of the stories that are in your mind that are not true, right? So, yeah, so this is why you have, in our tradition, we first begin with negation. So whatever you think about how things are out there, just wipe it away. Start with a blank slate. And then you can move on to the second stage, which is illallah, right? Except for God. And this is an act of affirmation, right? Because in reality, there's nothing else, right? Allah is reality, right? And that is a very empowering thing to know and to hold, right? But at the same time, that's not enough, right? Which is why the kalima doesn't end there. If you just say La ilaha illallah, your Islam is not complete, right? You have to affirm the nubuwwah of Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam. So you have to say Muhammad Rasulullah, which means Muhammad is the messenger of God. So why would you have to do that, right? Because if we're already talking about, we negated like the false reality, we accepted what reality actually is. So what does this have to do with it, right? So the reason is, Allah is infinite, right? And we're finite beings, and our minds can't capture what that means, right? So we need to know, what does that actually look like for us day to day? Like, how does that apply to me going home and having an argument with my wife and reconciling, or talking to my kids, or going to work, right? What actual use does that have in my life, right? And Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam is our example of how that manifests, right? So this is the realization of La ilaha illallah. The Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam is the realization of La ilaha illallah in the human form, right? So what does that do? So we talked about this food trap and kind of how a lot of us are trapped in it, right? Because of the stories we told ourselves and all these things, right? So a lot of this kind of has to do with this world of science, right?
Mind if I add one thing?
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah, one thing I wanted to add, just it's very easy to let what Arshad just mentioned, gloss over us. Not really internalize the act of negation. There was a series that Omar Suleiman did. I recommend everybody watch it, called Al-Bidayah wal-Nihaya, the beginning and the end. Some of you may have seen it, and he went through a classical text called The Beginning and the End. And at the beginning, he mentions that in the beginning there was Allah and there was nothing else. And he says that the Prophet Muhammad said in authentic narration that the greatest words, or the truest words rather, ever spoken by a poet, is that everything is disposable, more or less, or vain, except for Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And so I want you to really hammer home that point, and lay that as your foundation as you go through, like Arshad said, like as you go through your day-to-day in life, as like, what are the stories we're being told? Like, everything that we see in the world is disposable. If you just imagine that, like, there's so much, you put so much effort sometimes into like a school project, you put so much effort sometimes into like a deadline, into your relationships, and at one point in time, you know, can Allah wa lam yakun ma'ahu shay', like there's Allah, there's nothing else. So everything is disposable. So again, like I just want to hammer that home, like to try to internalize it, especially as you know, we try to reconcile what our epistemology is as Muslims, and kind of like what we've internalized, you know, growing up in the West. So I'm going to turn science back over to Arshad. He's the doctor, as they remember.
Speaking of internalizing things, so this is a big, maybe slightly controversial thing that we often have a hard time reconciling, right? So, you know, the way we are taught science, and I'm saying this as a science person, right? Like I did my undergrad in microbiology, and I went to medical school, and I spent a lot of time studying science, right? That's what I do in my job every day. But we have to ask ourselves, like, is there a story that we were told about science, right? And there definitely is. So the question is science neutral or objective? And I think for most people, the answer would be, yeah, that's the whole point of science, right? Is to just observe what's going on and like make conclusions and do experiments and kind of try to find out about the world, right? But if you actually read about the history of science, like, you know, I was fortunate to do another degree in religious studies, and we had a class that was called the history of science, another class called the philosophy of science, right? So if anyone is in this field, right, you know that science is not neutral and it has objectives, right? Particularly the way the tradition of science that we've inherited here in America, right, which is taken from the Western tradition, right? So there's a lot of assumptions that we take for granted. One of those is that, as far as science is concerned, God doesn't exist, or if he does, it's kind of irrelevant, except for a lot, right? The other thing is that man basically has free reign over the natural world, and it's kind of ours to do whatever we want with. And yeah, we take care of it for our own benefit, that's good, I guess, but more or less, like, we have control, and that's something we can control. Another thing is that we are always progressing, right? This is the sort of myth of modernity, right? That as time goes on, we're learning more and more and more, and the stuff that we knew back then maybe now is wrong, and so we can just kind of throw it out, right? And that there's always this forward progress. But these are big assumptions that we're making that are not necessarily true, right? And this colors kind of how we view science and how we use it in our lives. Because that's not how Muslims traditionally view or use science. Muslims engaged in scientific inquiry, right? And we're not like, you know, anti-science or something like that. But it's really important that we look at the natural world and we look at scientific inquiry with, especially if it's coming from people who have this worldview, with, at the very least, a healthy skepticism, and definitely through the lens of La ilaha illallah, right? That negation, that affirmation, if something aligns with our deen, and it's helpful to us, and it's helpful to us getting closer to Allah, which is our ultimate goal, alhamdulillah. But we should be really careful to not over-rely on conclusions that just come from this, right, field. Because, you know, going back to the food graph, right? So science is utilized in tracking, right? You know, we might think that, you know, if you look at, you know, if you go on like the internet and Instagram and TikTok and stuff like that now, people are always talking about, like, you need to eat this much protein in your diet, and you need to be doing this many steps a day, and you need to be eating this food, and you need to be avoiding that food, etc., right? These are all based on science, right? And that can lead to a lot of anxiety and a lot of, you know, misgivings about what we need to do. Whereas the Prophet ﷺ, he had a very different paradigm when it comes to food. So in the hadith, which is in Tirmidhi and in Majah, the Prophet ﷺ said, the son of Adam cannot fill a vessel worse than his stomach. It's enough for him to take a few bites to straighten his back. That's it. That's really kind of all you're supposed to eat. A few bites to straighten your back. Meaning is like you're so hungry that you're like kind of curled forward and you're like, oh man, I'm super hungry. And so you eat a little bit so you can stand up straight, right? But if he cannot do that, he may fill it with a third of food, a third of water, a third of air, right? So this is kind of our paradigm for eating and how to do this.
Next slide.
Yeah. So, I'm going to ask Malik, how do they track?
And I do want to just like give like a sneak peek into next week's discussion. We get into a lot of like this discussion today is like a lot of like the theoretical, right? Just kind of like laying the foundation of how should we even approach this subject. And we get into like a lot of the practical next week of like, okay, if I'm going to go take this hadith home to my family, I'm going to get in big trouble when my mom like scoops food into my plate. There's no way that's like 1/3. And so like we talk a lot about like the practical application next week and like what the adab was of the Prophet Muhammad ﷺ, like when he was given food, right? Like to the extent, there are narrations that he would be fasting and he would come home and he would be given food and he would be told like, I guess I'm not fasting anymore, more or less, right? I was fasting and I was intending to fast, but I'm not going to anymore. And so like that was the adab of the Prophet Muhammad ﷺ. And on the flip side, if he was intending to eat and not fast for that day, if he would come home and there was no food, he would say, today I'm fasting. Right, so like these are like, we as Muslims, we're like a middle nation, right? So we operate within like these bounds. And so inshallah next week we'll talk a lot about the practical, but I just wanted to hammer home, that aspect. If you're looking at it and wondering like, how can I actually do that? Inshallah next week we'll deep dive into that. So how do they trap you? The next slide. Okay. So how do they trap you? So I highly recommend, first of all, there's a lot of ways, right? We talked at the beginning about like whether you're addicted to like processed foods or you're addicted to the diet itself because you're thriving on a specific diet. Like that in and of itself is an addiction. But there's a book that I'll always reference called Salt, Sugar, and Fat. I don't know if you all are familiar with it. But the things that you'll read in that book, which are like verified things about what the food industry does, it's spooky, quite frankly. And it, like in reading that book, it was like another reason for me to try to get this going. So one of the things, for example, that they have like a non-profit research institute, either called Monel, I'm not sure about pronunciation. But in this research institute, they'll do things, for example, like take 12 samples of pudding, and they'll take a 6-year-old girl, and they'll put her in a room, and they'll put Big Bird in the room with her, and they'll bring out 2 cups of pudding at a time. This is all real, by the way. 2 cups of pudding at a time, and they'll give it to the girl, and they'll ask her to feed Big Bird the one that she likes more because they know that she's not going to tell the grown-up the truth. They asked that girl actually, like, do you prefer broccoli or the pudding? And she was like, the pudding. The broccoli, sorry. So kids will tell you what they want to hear, right? So these are the lengths with which like these research institutions will go to calculate something that is referred to as bliss point. And this wasn't something that didn't actually like originate in the food industry. But when the food industry heard that there was something called bliss point, where they try to basically optimize the sweetness of your food, right? They don't actually just dump as much sugar as they can in it. That would be like overly simplistic. They actually fund millions of dollars of research to calculate bliss point, to ensure that what we eat is the most ideal tasting thing you can imagine. And they're optimizing these 3 ingredients of salt, sugar, and fat to keep us coming back. The book talks about like a graduate student in the 1960s who felt bad for his lab rats and fed them Fruit Loops, and then observed that they like went nuts for it basically, and broke their normal behavioral patterns, right? And so this starts to get into the dopamine loop. The dopamine loop the good thing about it is it can be rewired, but like the dopamine loop in like the most simplistic way is the behavior of these rats that this grad student encountered. So basically he gave them these Fruit Loops, he realized they loved it. He was actually just like trying to be nice to them. But then when he realized like how crazy they went for it, he took some Fruit Loops and put it in the most like open and bright part of the cage. And the lab rats, they have a tendency to stick to like the dark corners of the cage. And they don't really want to go out into the light, bright, open areas, right? So they broke that pattern and they went out and they got the Fruit Loops and they went nuts for it. And that's, you know, the dopamine cycle, right? You have your stimulus. The dopamine release is when the rats, or us, right, ingest something. It doesn't have to be sweet, it doesn't even have to be related to food, right? There's so many things that release dopamine. But in the context of the food trap, right, they had their dopamine release, they experienced pleasure, and then there's like this desire for more. Right, the scientists reinforced that desire by giving them more. Right, so now they have a habit formation, and now there's an addiction. And it does not take much to become addicted to something. And so now they broke their behavioral patterns. And by the way, like years later, this grad student grew up to be like, I don't know, like a professor, I believe. And he was doing another experiment with lab rats. Had nothing to do with, you know, like dopamine or anything like that. But he needed to fatten them up for the experiment. And he used some sort of like animal chow or something to try to fatten them up. Something with like very high calorie and densely, you know, dense amount of calories. And they couldn't consume enough of it to fatten up. So he remembered that happened years back to him, and he told his now students, like, go out and get cookies and get sweets, and they gobbled it up, and they like attained, you know, the weight that he was trying to get them to attain. So that's like in a nutshell, you know, what the dopamine loop is. All right, Arsha, do you want to take this slide? You good? Okay. So again, like the stories we tell ourselves, right? We have the food industry, you know, like the big food companies that I'm mentioning. We have the fitness industry, what's their goal? The pharmaceutical industry, what's their goal? And the healthcare industry, what's their goal? At the end of the day, they all have the same underlying goal, right? And this is like not to say, by the way, that there are not individuals within any of these industries who are actually doing like good, honest work, right? Like my dad was in microbiology, genetics, approached experiments, you know, objectively, you know, to the best of like his ability. You know, Arshad applies like to the best of his ability, an objective lens, right? And these are not individuals who are optimizing on the dollar bills, but you would be naive and you would be missing on a very important point if you didn't zoom out, right? And kind of like follow that money trail. I mean, the United States, for example, which is like a titan in the fitness industry, has the most gyms by far compared to like any other country in the world. Yet we're also the most obese. Like it's very difficult to reconcile those two things, right? Like Planet Fitness thrives on, and I have no beef with Planet Fitness if you're watching, I apologize. I had a membership. But they thrive on like this low cost to enter. I think it's like $10 a month or whatever it may be. You know, knowing eventually like you're gonna stop coming, and you're probably gonna be too lazy to like cancel your membership right away, right? So these are like the things that we have to keep in mind. You know, pharmaceutical industry, healthcare industry. You know, we have family members who work in various pharmacies, and they're like, you know, as pharmacists, and at the end of the day, like the pharmaceutical companies will come in and be like, we want you to, you know, they want you to hit XYZ quota of like selling, you know, specific types of medications and things like that. So these are the things to kind of like keep in mind. In the healthcare industry, I mean, you can talk more to that one. What is that like?
Yeah, I mean, if anyone else here works in the healthcare industry, you know, it's, you know, most people who go into the healthcare industry as like a doctor are not trying to profit on people, right? Trying to help people. But very quickly, you realize, like, they're just trying to make money, essentially, right? Like, I remember in residency, we have patients admitted in the hospital, and if they hang around too long, there's an administrator that's coming around saying, hey, we're going to discharge this patient. Right? We need to get the bed room. We need to clear the room. We need to get more throughput. Because if someone hanging out too long, then they're losing money, basically. So these are like real things that happen. And other doctors can tell you this. And it goes to all different parts of the healthcare industry. Right? So, like Donna said, same with the pharmaceutical industry. Right? You know, the food industry is not interested necessarily in making sure everyone is healthy and fed. The fitness industry is not necessarily interested in everyone being fit and healthy. The pharmaceutical industry is not interested in making sure there's life-saving medicine for everyone. And even the healthcare industry is not necessarily invested in everyone being healthy, right? They're actually all invested in the opposite thing, because that's what allows them to keep you in that trap and to keep extracting dollar. So,
Mike died.
Mike died.
Mike died.
We can keep talking.
We can project it.
So you're right there. So we talked about all these goals that these industries have, but what is the Muslim's goal? What's our goal? And it's very simple. Our goal is Allah. That's at the end of the day. That's all we're trying to do. Okay. So when we say our goal is Allah, like, now what does that mean?
Yeah, so it's like, this is where it gets difficult, right? But like we know, like from narrations, that like the thing that will be most beloved to us in Jannah is the moment that we actually get to see like Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala's face, right? And so when we're talking about, you know, our goal, you know, and actually getting to Allah and that we get to be in His company and we actually get to witness Him, the objective, right, is that we are attempting to ensure that we're paving the path to Jannah to be in His company. And so how do you actually use food to achieve that goal, right? Because that's ultimately like our objective, right? If we recall back to what we said at the beginning, everything is disposable except for Allah. And so you wouldn't want to be with things that are disposable. That cannot be our goal. That cannot be the Muslim's goal, right? So food for the sake of food cannot be our goal, right? A certain physique for the sake of a certain physique, it cannot be our goal. Attaining a degree for the sake of a specific degree, even if we tell ourselves like that degree is so that we can, like you said, get married, raise a family, like that cannot be our goal, right? Even in the Quran itself, like al-malu wal-banuna zinatul hayat ad-dunya, like the wealth and even your children are just the adornments of this world. So even they're temporary. Like even those are just extra luxuries that you have in this world. And so we all need to ensure that we're reorienting ourselves to the Muslim paradigm, which is La ilaha illallah, right? And so there's a book that we'll rely pretty heavily on when it comes to the practical, both like next week and in terms of like our program, inshallah, that we're rolling out, you know, to help the ummah when it comes to, you know, kind of getting over the hump and breaking the food trap. Breaking the Two Desires, it's a book from a larger volume by Imam al-Ghazali, and in the book he explains how to break the desire of eating and sexual desire, and he explains the connection between them, right? But in the book he also defines what is our purpose of eating, and so the purpose, in accordance with his definition, which if you look at the book, you know, he'll include all of his citations of where he gets this from, you know, the hadith and things like that in the Quran. But it's the preservation of life and the gaining of strength for worship. And so if you look at it from that lens, and again, we'll get to the practical, but sometimes in Islam we swing the pendulum to one extreme to understand like our purpose, right? If you were to look at food from the lens of preservation of life and from strength for worship, and we internalized it, our day-to-day diet would look completely different, right? And even the modern research will tell you, right, that the kind of like the gateway to like the 4 horsemen of the diseases, right, is through the stomach. Mm-hmm. And you know, I don't know how long it took for modern science to confirm it, but this is even, you know, prior to the Muslims, right? Even the Greeks would have, you know, mentioned the issues of the stomach, and the Prophet Muhammad ﷺ affirmed that the root of the diseases are from the stomach, and it was not limited to physical disease, right? So the diseases of the heart as well, and we'll go more into the practical side of things from Ghazali, but just internalizing this and asking yourself before you take a bite, is this for preservation of life or is this for strengthening worship? And just that litmus test alone would get you very far. But at some point, we'll likely falter because it's very, very difficult to apply that in the world that we live in today, right? We're talking about having to break like a dopamine cycle, whether it's because you're addicted to the processed foods or you're addicted to the diet culture. And I think you mentioned it the other day, like the guy on like YouTube and his channel who's like dumping his face in like an ice bath in the morning and tells you have to do it too, right? Like this whole culture, you can actually get addicted to the whole culture. And so the dopamine cycle really, it has a strong hold on many of us. All right, so the path out. I want you to talk to that one.
So how do you get out, right? And like Malik said, in the next session, next week, we're gonna go a lot more into like the depth, like the practical nature of this. But we have a map to get out. And again, it starts with La ilaha illallah Muhammadur Rasulullah. But extrapolating some of these things from the Quran and the Sunnah, the scholars kind of created this framework of the appetites, right? And the word they use to refer to that is the nafs, right? Which sometimes translated as like the spirit or the self, so very broadly, depending on the scheme you look at, sometimes there's 5 or 7 or 9, but the easiest one to understand is this kind of 3-part breakdown of the nafs. So the nafs is kind of like the self, or sometimes maybe in like psychology we think about it as like the ego, if anyone studies psychology, right? So the bottom level of the nafs, and as I go through this, kind of try to think about when it comes to food specifically, but also just to the world in general, like where are you on this map here? So the bottom level is called nafs al-amara bis-su, nafs al-amara, right? This is the commanding self, and commanding to evil, to wrongdoing. So this is kind of when your desires control you, right? You're just you're eating because like all you want to do is like go out, and all you're thinking about is like, I really want to try that new like fried chicken place, or like I really want to try that new sushi place, or like whatever your thing is, and you're just straight trapped. You're not considering how it's affecting your spiritual or physical health, right? And this can go for any sin, right, or any thing that's going to lead you away from Allah. And then there comes a point where you realize, like, okay, maybe I shouldn't be doing this. Like, maybe I should stop eating something like fried chicken sandwiches, right, or whatever it is. And you kind of feel bad about it, and you have this like guilt and remorse. But sometimes like there's a really good looking place, and you just kind of take it, right? And you go, and then you feel bad again, and then you try again, and you go back and forth, back and forth, back and forth. So this is the second stage, is called nafs al-lawwama. So lawwama is like the reproaching self, like the self that's blaming itself, right? And this is a good place to be. This is like progress, right? And then the final stage is nafs al-mutma'inna, right? Which is the soul, the self, the ego that's at rest. It's the soul that you fought with yourself for a long time, and now you're kind of not worried about it. Like, if someone brings you something nice to eat, you'll eat it. If it's not there, you're not really worried about it, and you're kind of relaxed about it at that point, right? But knowing at the same time you can fall back down, but really that's the goal to attain it. So if we break this down a little bit, like how do we navigate this? So if you go to the next slide. So we can think about this, a lot of times if you're in the corporate world, like they talk about these levels of competence, right? This is usually quite like skills. So the first level is called unconscious incompetence. So basically, you're bad at doing something, but you don't know that you're bad at doing it, right? And you don't really know how to do something. Then it moves up to conscious incompetence. So you're bad at doing something that you're trying to do, and you know when you realize you're not so good at it, right? But it's better than at least not knowing that you're bad at it. Then it moves into conscious competence, right? So you're trying really hard to be good at whatever this thing is, staying away from unhealthy food or working out or eating healthy or whatever it is. But it's like a lot of work for you to do that, right? And you're fighting, until it you just keep working at it and it becomes second nature. And then you move into this unconscious competence, right? And Imam al-Ghazali in the book, he kind of talks about this same process, and he harkens it to like taming a horse, which I guess for us, we don't tame horses anymore, but I guess it's relevant to people. But it's a useful example because when you first tame a horse, the horse is really wild, and they're not listening to anything you're saying, and you have to watch it all the time, and you have to be really harsh with it. And you keep being harsh with it, keep training it, and you keep spending time with it, you keep reinforcing it until finally they call it breaking it in, broken, right? It's trained now. And once it's trained, you don't have to be so harsh with it anymore. It'll listen to you, it'll let you ride it, it won't keep you off your tail and check it on. And so training the soul, training the self is kind of like training a horse. But even once you've broken it in, you can't just like let it run free. You still gotta tie it up. It's still a horse, right? You gotta still watch it a little bit, but that level of effort is not required anymore to keep it there. So we can kind of juxtapose these two things, right? So this is the kind of the path, right? So when you're in this nafs al-amara where you just can't control yourself, whether or not you may be unconsciously doing it and not even realizing you're in sin or in ghafla, which is like heedlessness, basically. So because overeating and indulging in food is not necessarily sinful, but it's not good for your soul, right? And then at some point you may move into this conscious incompetence where you're like, okay, I know I probably shouldn't be doing this, but I still really like to, have a piece of cake at the end of the day, or whatever it is. Right?
I feel like you said that so authentically. You're speaking from the heart. Yeah, just a disclaimer also, and this is one of the things Ghazali says in the book, is like he outlines like 10 of the benefits of hunger in the book, right? And he lists like all of these stories of the saints of the past that like sound so extreme. Like a man saying like, I haven't let salt, I believe it was Malik ibn Dinar, he says like, I haven't let salt enter my home for 20 years. Right? And it's like almost like, it's like out of fear of like this addiction. Right? But then Ghazali kind of like swings the pendulum back in the other direction and says like, if you're reading and you think like, these are like unattainable states, and like, how am I going to get to this goal? Then realize like, it's not the goal. Like the goal is actually not to be in that state because again, we were raised as like a middle nation, right? So the goal is to get to the middle, but back to the original point, like Arshad and I are on this journey, right? The same way like all of us are on this journey. And one of the things Ghazali cites is like two of the most dangerous things, even more dangerous than being in the trap, is that you kind of feel like you're out of the trap, but to the people you present yourself as out of the trap, but then you go home, right? And you eat what you eat while nobody around is looking. And so it'd be very, I think, disingenuous of us to come up here and say like, we don't still indulge, like we don't still enjoy, like we do, right? And so I just want to make sure to hear that. I actually intended to mention that at the beginning, but as we're going here, sometimes it just flows more naturally. We're all like on the journey. Like nobody should look up here and be like, oh man, these guys are like broken out of the food trap and like they're free. It's like no, you still, and I think Yahya Rodis, from the Maqasid community in Pennsylvania, he's like a proponent of the 80-20 rule, when it comes to food. So again, we'll get into the practical, but as we're discussing this, I don't want anybody to like look up here and be like how did these guys, do it? Like we're all figuring it out together, inshallah.
Yeah, no, Jazakallah khair. That's a really important point. And I'm saying these kind of tongue-in-cheek things, but I don't want this to be like a shaming thing, right? Because this is something that everyone struggles with, and this is this is literally a trap, right? So I definitely recognize that can be a sensitive thing for a lot of people. So don't mistake anything we're saying. We're very much stuck in the same trap as everyone else. But inshallah, we're working on getting out. And I think most of us, if you look at this scheme, most of us are probably here. Most of us are probably in nafs al-amara, right? We're somewhere in this place where we kind of realize what we should be doing. And this doesn't apply just to food, right? It applies to prayer, it applies to fasting, it applies to how you're speaking to, treating your family, all of these things, right? So, ultimately the goal is to try to use this knowledge and use this reframing to get out. Because going back to that original story that I was saying about my story, right? The thing that got me out of it, and again, I'm still working on it, but the thing that helped me to progress was, it wasn't any specific formula that I followed. It was a shift in the mindset. Right? And that's what Islam gives you. That's what this formula of La ilaha illallah enables you to do. And it empowers you. Because sometimes it can feel like you're trapped, right? Or like you can't get out. Like what are you supposed to do? You try everything, right? And you keep failing. But we know that like Allah can make anything happen, right? And Allah can heal anything that you have, and Allah can get you out of any bad situation that you're in. But the trick is, how do you inculcate that reliance on Allah? And again, that's the process of negating these stories you told yourself, affirming the truth that all of those things are real, right? Allah is real. Jannah is real. The fire is real. The Prophet ﷺ is telling the truth, right? So this is the story that we have to tell ourselves as Muslims, because that's the real story. So just to conclude your story. I'll have Malik close this time.
All right, Bismillah. So, Badr Uthman is here. Wait, Uthman. How does an Allah-centered mindset help you? So, one of the stories in Breaking the Two Desires that I really love is a story about, it's mentioned in a, I don't think it's actually in Breaking the Two Desires, but it's mentioned by a scholar who's explaining Breaking the Two Desires, right? But one of the saints of the past, named Ibrahim ibn Adham. He's from a town called Balkh, which is I think in present-day Afghanistan. He lived in a palace. They say he was the prince of Balkh once upon a time. And he lived in a palace, and he's in bed, and he hears like a knocking sound on his roof. And so the man goes up to the roof, and he finds a man up there just kind of like wandering around on the roof of his palace. He's like, bro, what are you doing? And the guy's like, I'm looking for my camel. And he's like, you're looking for, he says, I'm looking for my camel on the top of your palace. And he's like, you're looking for a camel like on my palace? That's the most ridiculous thing like I've ever heard. And he's like, it's not as ridiculous as, all right, we'll pause for a minute, yeah? if you need to make wudu or anything, definitely the right time.
We have like 5 minutes till the call.
Okay, all right. So yeah, like Arshad said, a little bit of a cliffhanger. But so Ibrahim al-Adham, right, he asks this man, like, what are you doing? He says, I'm looking for my camel on your palace. And he's like, that's the most ridiculous thing ever. And the man says, it's not as ridiculous as searching for Allah in this palace. And Ibrahim al-Adham, his heart is like completely pierced. I think you summarized it really well. You were like, this is a man who was Muslim, right? Like he had Allah as his framework. But sometimes the dunya like overtakes us. And especially with food, we'll talk about this in more depth. The stomach is one of Shaitan's easiest gateways to the heart. Right? So like Ibrahim al-Adham is living in this palace, and it's much harder to remember Allah. Like it's an uphill battle to remember Allah in a palace. It's a lot harder. I mean, and Alhamdulillah, like in Spain, it's a little easy, right? Like you're there, like this is the Muslim Empire, right? Like this was an awesome time, and you see that Allah everywhere. But like if you go buy like a nice home in Great Falls or like wherever it is in this area or Langley, like it's gonna be a lot harder. Like you have to work, you have to exert yourself, and it's not impossible. And Ghazali talks about like some of the saints of the past, they disciplined themselves, right, in like these extreme ways. But once they kind of broke themselves in, right, like the tamed horse, they kind of swing the pendulum back to what we would call like normalcy today, right? But our position today, and I'm speaking for myself first and foremost, is not the position of the saints of the past. I haven't figured that out. I haven't broken this up yet, right? And so we have to be very careful with how much we consume, whether it is, through our mouths, into our stomachs, or the things that we watch, right? Like the TV is like a gateway into your home. Like a litmus test for that is like, would you let those people into your home that you're watching on the TV? And so the Allah-centered mindset, how does it help you? And I bothered Uthman there a minute ago, but he started, Rise, which is this coaching organization that helps, helps a lot of people, but he focuses a lot on Muslim men. And one of the things he tells you is, when you receive your book on the Day of Judgment, right? We're all going to receive a book on the Day of Judgment that's outlined our deeds. And, so as it says that, we know that it doesn't leave out even like the deed that's the weight of an atom. So when you get your book, what's the executive summary that you want Allah to have documented in this book for you, or rather the angels to have documented in this book for you? And so making a life mission is kind of like Uthman's premise, and Allah-centered life mission. The executive summary of your book is like his approach to like having that Allah-centered mindset. And for me right now, like he calls it your kitab goal. Like, what's your kitab goal? And that's like a practical application of we're all in search of Allah, right? If you remember, there was like that slide. It was like, what does that actually mean, practically speaking? All of the prophets, they had a mission. Like Allah gave them a clear mission. And so the question is like, what mission are you going to hone in on your life to help fuel that Allah-centered mindset? Do you want to be known as like, the best doctor who helped, change the whole system from within? Uthman pushes us to like have very lofty missions, right? And so the mission that like I walked away with was to change the food system. And to start from the paradigm that Arshad mentioned, which is La ilaha illallah. Because if you start with like the secular tradition, you're already 10 steps back. So we need to, as Muslims, like break that mindset, especially now in light of what's going on in Bethesda. There's so many things in that book I mentioned, salt, sugar, and fat. Like, they even happen to cite an Israeli food engineer in the book who was upset that the American Heart Association made a recommendation to reduce sugar intake. And his quote that's in the book is like, let's get practical. Like, this is who like you're up against when you're talking about like changing the systems of like modern society. And look at who the book happened to cite, as like the ally of the modern food system. You know what I mean? It's not written by a Palestinian or a Muslim or like anybody who's pro-Palestine, nothing like that. We got all questions.
Yeah, you're a real fighter. I'm like 10 fighter. You want to head over to the photo?
Yeah.
I'll put this in there.
So I want to talk about how that's get back on track. And I noticed that a lot of restaurants
It's difficult. It's a difficult landscape.